Well, welcome to Holy Trinity and St Saviour's Sermons. Here we seek to live life to the full, and I hope this sermon inspires you to do exactly that.
Our reading this morning is taken from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 11. I'll be starting at verse 28. Finding rest for your soul on the Sabbath. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on the Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath, and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. This is the word of the Lord.
I want to point out that the next story is entirely fictional. A husband is given, on the morning of his birthday, 2 ties by his wife. And they're meeting up for lunch to celebrate, and he thinks, do you know what? I'm going to surprise her. I'm going to dress up for the occasion. I'm going to put on some smart togs, and I'm going to put one of those ties on. And his wife's waiting in the restaurant as he walks in, and he comes up to the table and goes, and she says, "So what's wrong with the other one?" I don't know about you, and I do apologize to those of you who don't have children, but one of the biggest mistakes we ever made was to have 2 children. Now, please, when you recite this to any one of them you meet, be clear that they're the one that we really wanted, okay? But you will always, when you have 2 children, come to a point where you know how you constantly say to them, "Oh, but we love you both the same." You will come to a point where you have to make a decision that means one of them gets something and the other one doesn't. It might be time, effort, presents, as in CE presents, or whatever. But sometimes, and the other one will always say, what about me then? And you have to say, oh, I'm sorry. And the fact is that life is messy, isn't it? And you can decide on all the principles to live by that you want to, but life is always going to be messy. Eventually, you're going to come to an impossible decision for which there is no manual. Which brings us to Jesus' disciples walking through a field. And they're walking through a field and they're a bit peckish, and they help themselves to a bit of the corn. Interestingly enough, no one in this says, what about these people nicking stuff? But that's an entirely different matter. And they help themselves to some of the heads of corn, and they start rolling them in their hands and eating them. And there is outrage, absolute outrage. And what's the problem here? You may be asking yourself. The problem here, of course, that it's the Sabbath day. And the disciples are milling. They are working by milling corn on the Sabbath. And this is terrible. Now, before you start on the Pharisees, let's think before we go on. Do you like people who want to do what God says? I bet you do, don't you? If somebody came to you and said, I want to follow everything God says in the Bible, that's what I want to do. I'm going to go there, I'm going to do that. So did the Pharisees. That was the whole tenor of their life. That was the base of what they wanted. They wanted to do what God said. And in fact, they wanted everyone to do what God said. And if I stood here and say to you, do you want everyone to do what God says? You will all say, amen. Yes, we do. That's the Pharisees. That's what they wanted. They've become a byword for us, haven't they? If you really want to put them into a box, the Pharisees were the Jewish evangelicals of their day. The Bible was everything. So what's the problem? They say we want to do what God says. And the Sabbath day and not working on the Sabbath day, God says. And he doesn't just say it, he says it as one of the 10 Commandments, the key message in the Old Testament. And it's not just in the 10 Commandments, it's actually, if you go and look it up, the longest of the 10 Commandments, and it's very, very clear. Not you, not your wife, not your children, not your servants, not your animals. No one works on the Sabbath day. So they're keen to do what God says. So keen, in fact, that over the centuries since that was written down, they've worked out how to absolutely make sure you don't break it, by making sure you don't work on the Sabbath day. Now, unfortunately, like so many of us who take the Bible seriously, they've forgotten a simple truth. Life is messy. You see, life doesn't fall into nice, neat categories that you can say, don't do that, do that, that's a bit dodgy, this is okay, you're going to be okay if you'd follow this path, but not that. No, you see, life is messy. And Jesus, being Jesus, points this out to them by quoting from, the Bible. Because the Bible is full of people having to approach the messiness of life. Have you ever read some of the stories in the Bible and say, what's that doing in the Bible? How are they acting? That's terrible. Why is God saying that? So, because the life is messy. And there are all kinds of people who get themselves into all kinds of scrapes and all kinds of situations, and there's no really, you can't, I know, we don't know what to do. You see, God didn't give us his word and then sit back with a big stick waiting to whack us whenever we did the wrong thing. What he's given us is a word that's full of people that face the messiness of life and have to deal with it. David turns up. He's on the run from Saul, and he turns up in a small village, and he goes to the local priest, and the priest says, I got nothing except the special bread. Only the priests are supposed to eat it, and David says, we're starving. And he says, you know what? Have the bread. That's in the Old Testament. It's in the Bible. And does God go, how dare you? Whatever. No, it says, off they went. David ate the bread that only the priests are supposed to eat, and it's in the Bible. And he does it. And David is one of the greatest men of the Old Testament. And the priests in the temple, Jesus says, look, hold on a second. You're telling my disciples that they're busily milling on the Sabbath and they're crime. He says, priests in the temple are sacrificing animals on the Sabbath. They're butchering. Are they allowed to work on this? Yes, they are. God says they can. Hold on a second. Life's a bit messy, isn't it? It's a bit soft around the edges than you would like it to be. Your sheep falls in a ditch. What are you going to do? Oh, of course, if you're a super pious Pharisee, what you'd do is you'd say, I can't work on the Sabbath. I'm going to pray that God looks after my sheep until midnight when I'll go and rescue. No, you won't. You'll just go and pull it out the ditch, won't you? You'll be farming on the Sabbath, won't you? Quite happily. Life is messy. It doesn't fit nice, easy categories that you can say, don't, do, don't. It's all messy. It's all places where if you want to be picky, you're breaking the law. But life is like that. Stuff happens. And what are you going to do, says Jesus? Are you, every time something happens, are you going to whip out Bible Google and type it in? And out is going to come solution number 3,428 is the number you need, the code that will solve your problem. You see, if you adopt that approach to life, you find that eventually issue number 3,429 comes along, and you haven't got that one covered. The problem for the Pharisees in relation to the Sabbath, that every answer to every problem to do with Sabbath basically brings up answer number one: do nothing. As long as you do nothing, you're safe. You have followed God. And Jesus basically says, what kind of life is that? What kind of life is it where you just sit back and do nothing because that's obeying God? No, it's not. Now, Jesus doesn't just beat up the Pharisees in what he's saying, because he says some very important things about Sabbath. He doesn't say, you guys expect to sit around doing nothing on the Sabbath, and do you know what? Forget Sabbath. Forget the whole thing. Just go on and do the right thing. Forget, go with your hearts. Forget about Sabbath. It's not important. No, in fact, he says something quite opposite to that, in fact. In all the three gospel accounts where this story comes up, he describes himself, doesn't he? He says something incredible about himself. He says, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. When it comes to how I should react to the idea of Sabbath, he says, I am the Lord of Sabbath. Now, I said a couple of weeks ago when I was stood here, and don't worry, it's a while now before I'm going to come back again. I seem to be here a lot. But a couple of weeks ago, I said about, the fact that trying to pin Jesus down and say, he's always just a great moral teacher. He went round making these kind of claims all the time. He didn't just say, I think that it would be great if you did this on the Sabbath. He said, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. What a claim to make. And he said all kinds of other stuff about Sabbath in different accounts of the story. We see various different words coming from. One of the things he said, which I think is so important for us to understand when it comes to this idea about God's intention for you, he said, Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for Sabbath. In other words, he said, if you are taking yourself and you are having to crush yourself into a box to fit into somebody's rules about what Sabbath means, then you're wrong. It's meant to be for you. It's meant to fit you and make you at peace and to enjoy the peace of God. If your view of obedience to God is hurting people, there is something wrong with it, Jesus says, because it's meant to fit people, not hurt people. He says in here, he says, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? I mean, what crazy question is that? The Pharisees are saying, let this guy, he's got to carry on suffering. It's the Sabbath. Maybe tomorrow you can heal him. Jesus says, what? Is it lawful just to let something like that slide just because it's the Sabbath? Is it not lawful to do good on the Sabbath? And he puts it even further when we read Luke's account. He said, what is lawful? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to destroy it? You've got a choice here, guys. He said, here's the opportunity for this man to be free of something that's plagued him forever, and you're going to tell him he has to wait another day? And look at the anger as he stares down these pompous, self-righteous teachers who can bear the thought of allowing someone to suffer unnecessarily, and then he reminds them of the words of the Bible. He says, quotes from Hosea's prophecy, he says this, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. What underpins everything about God's demands in the law, he says, effectively, he says, you can take all your law-keeping and your petty-fogging, penny-pinching, sacrificing on altar, everything, and you can stick it where the sun don't shine, because I desire mercy. That is the underpinning, total undergirding of the way God sees us. There is this terrible, terrible, terrible misconception in people's hearts about the God of the Old Testament hates everyone, but the God of the New Testament is nice. Read the Old Testament for yourself, and you will find, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Where do you find love your neighbor as yourself? It's in the Old Testament. Jesus is quoting. Where do you find a people saved from slavery, released into the freedom of the children of God? It's in the Old Testament. Jesus says the problem is not that you've got this Old Testament, but I'm going to give you something new. He says the problem with you is you haven't understood the actual words that God says to you, which is, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. The first rule is not don't do anything. The first rule is mercy. So, what should Sabbath be like? What should your experience of Sabbath be? How does Jesus, Lord of the Sabbath, want you to find the rest that is the intention of the day, the intention of his presence in your life? Well, you'll find it's no coincidence in the Bible that Matthew chapter 12 follows Matthew chapter 11. There's your theological insight for today. Because Matthew didn't just throw together a few stories, he put them in an order for a very good reason. Why does he put these stories of Sabbath in at this point? Because it follows on from those words of Jesus, where he says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." This is what the Lord of the Sabbath wants you to enjoy, his rest. Sabbath rest for your soul, for your life. Now, the key word in that entire passage was the shortest one. It was the word my. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. The focus of being a follower of Jesus is not unsurprisingly Jesus. I don't know if I have to tell you that again, because the trouble is that so many of us forget this. It's church, it's meetings, it's doing this. It might even be your Bible reading. It might be going to this committee. It might be doing this charity work, which is all good. But when we forget that the focus of being a follower of Jesus is Jesus himself, then all that stuff becomes a burden rather than what he wants it to be, which is where we will find rest for our souls. As with so many things about what Jesus says, the issue is not about days or actions or events. It's about a person and our focus on him. You see, for your Sabbath rest, Jesus calls you to take on my yoke. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, and you will find rest for your souls. And I want to finish by just briefly addressing two kinds of people who may well be in the room or may be at home watching here today. Two kinds of people that I think this is particularly applicable to. Some of you take on too much. Some of you take on too much. Not necessarily too much to do, though that is probably true as well. But it's more to do with you taking on too much responsibility for what is. Somewhere in your heart, there is a little voice that keeps saying to you, it all depends on me. The world will stop turning effectively if I don't do something about this. I have to do this. I have to be there. This is me and it's on my watch. You can never rest because there is so much that needs to be done. Even when you're not doing, you're thinking about doing. And it rests heavy on you. And I want to say to you, if you're that kind of person where you feel the weight of the responsibility on you, those words of Jesus when he says, "Take my yoke upon you. Take my yoke upon you." Jesus basically says, you obviously know the picture. It's two oxen in the field, and the yoke connects you to the other ox, and you're working together. And Jesus basically is saying, look, share it with me. Share the load. In fact, let me have the load and walk with me. See, Jesus says, look, you don't have to take responsibility for the world. I'm doing that. Every time I was preparing for this, I kept humming to myself that old song, "He's got the whole world in his hands." And in some ways, Jesus is basically saying he's got the whole world on his shoulders. And if you constantly almost live in fear because you feel the responsibility that you have upon you, please try to let it go, to hand it over and say, it's not my responsibility, all of it. I'm not saying stop doing what you're doing. Thank you for what you're doing. You're a hero. But don't bear the load. Do what you can with what you've got and walk with a Jesus who wants to share that responsibility with you and share the load. Walk with him. Jesus wants you to have Sabbath. He wants you to have rest. He wants you not to feel that your whole life has to be a grind where you constantly have to bear everything, the burden of the world. He says, take my yoke. Let me take the load with you, and you will find rest for your souls. That's one kind of people. Conversely, there's the other, an opposite approach, where following Jesus is all about finding peace. It's all about my peace. And anything that ripples that peace is to be pushed away. It's too hard. It's too much. I'm going to have Sabbath, by which I mean Jesus is meant to make me feel better. And other stuff just makes it hard. So I'm going to stop and not do anything, and I'm just going to enjoy that peace. But you see, contrary to those who try to bear the burden of the yoke alone, you throw the yoke off. And you say, I don't want any yoke, because that's hard. And we assume that this brings peace, but Jesus doesn't say here that we find peace by retreating, by pushing things away, and by saying, I won't. Jesus says we find peace by being yoked to him and walking together in doing. Sabbath is not about what we avoid. That's the mistake the Pharisees made. Sabbath is about how we immerse ourselves in the kingdom, how we walk alongside Jesus. Because when we do that, we're walking in the same direction, taking on the burdens of the kingdom alongside him. And if we do that, we can't go wrong. Rest, but rest in the yoke. Walk with him. Take my yoke.